This talk is part of a six-session seminar series, Out of the Shadows of Empire, run by the Institute of Classical Studies and Classical Reception Studies Network. In accord with the growing attention to the discipline of classics' historic entanglement with empire, we invited scholars from around the world to speak on how writers and creators have subversively redeployed Greco-Roman culture to critique and deconstruct the colonial legacy. Today's talk follows on some fantastic presentations already by Patrice Rankin, Lesejo Chauka, and Justine McConnell on receptions in the USA, South Africa, and the Caribbean. Today we'll be turning our attention to Zimbabwe with Dr. Madhlozi Moyo.
Dr. Madhlozi Moyo is a researcher in classical studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa, where he is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Classics. He has published on Cicero in Zimbabwe as part of the recently edited volume Mzansi Classics, Dialogues in Decolonization from Southern Africa of 2022. And he has also published on comparative analyses in archaic Greek and Kalanga oral wisdom literatures, on modern Zimbabwean poetry, and on classical allusions in Marachera's prose works. He is currently conducting the first comprehensive treatment of classical presences in Zimbabwe for his forthcoming monograph, Classical Presences in Zimbabwe, Colonization, Education, and the Arts, which will examine the long and complex history of how classics have been taught, received, and influenced the country's education system, architecture, and literature. His seminar presentation today, entitled The Obelisks of Matabeleland, Cecil John Rhodes, Conquest and the Classics, will give us a taste of his important and innovative research, and we cannot wait to hear it. So over to you, Madhlozi.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. And yeah, thanks to everyone that I have met previously in relation to this project. This is a work in progress, as Leah has said. Maybe the first chapter of my book, really, which looks at the history of the classics in Rhodesia/Zimbabwe, because it's the same place, and yeah, for me, unlike maybe other previous seminars or presentations, this is work in progress, and I'm putting myself at the risk of masquerading as an expert in Zimbabwean or Rhodesian history, which I am not. I am a classicist, but I find the presence of classics in Zimbabwe to be fascinating. So here goes. Rhodes was an avid classicist, says the front page of the website of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The same website acknowledges that it was at Oxford that Rhodes got most of his political ideologies. There is no consensus, as far as I can find out, as to whether Rhodes graduated with his degree or not. But the website above mentioned says that Rhodes was prevented by his health from completing his studies, while other views are that he graduated with a pass degree. Whatever the case, it is clear that the discipline played a role in his worldview, as this work will try to prove. Obviously, Rhodes does not mark the beginning of the contact between Africa and the West, because many European people had come before him. I will mention a few conspicuous ones, like Father Gonçalo da Silveira, who was martyred in Mashonaland in the 1560s, Jan van Riebeeck arriving in Cape Town in 1652, the German explorer Karl Mauch in the mid-19th century, David Livingstone, amongst a host many others. My choice to begin with Rhodes is that he founded new territories, some of which were named after his name, as if he were an Alexander the Great, or a Caesar, or even a Constantine. Let's go to the first slide. The next slide, please, with the face of Rhodes. And maybe the next one as well. So that's Rhodes, and that's Rhodesia, the country that was named after him. I've deliberately put the map of Rhodesia and not of Zimbabwe, so the names are a bit different now. It is the pseudo-explorations like those of the German explorer Karl Mauch that recommended the settlement north of the Transvaal, namely on the Zimbabwean plateau, for the English. On seeing Great Zimbabwe ruins for the first time, Karl Mauch thought he had discovered the biblical land, the lost city of Ophir, where Queen Sheba got all the riches that she gave to King Solomon. Hence, there was talk of a second rand, the first rand being in South Africa. As a result, European settlers scrambled to occupy the Zimbabwean plateau, galvanized by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. That some learned British believed this can also be seen in John Milton's Paradise Lost, where he readily associated Monomotapa with the city of Ophir. This background was set up by Tomé Lopez, a companion of Vasco da Gama, who was also impressed by the stone structures of Great Zimbabwe and convinced himself that they had not been built by African people. Unfortunately, Karl Mauch discredited the local black population, just like Lopez, of having built the Great Zimbabwe, thereby attracting the wrath of decolonial scholars. For example, Sabelo Ndlovu says of Karl Mauch, I quote, Karl Mauch made a lot of publicity out of his discovery of gold, and his high-blown nonsense about the land of Ophir were captured by the Transvaal Argus, which spread the rumors of rich gold fields in Zimbabwe. That Rhodes used the classics in his imperialistic drive has been argued before. For example, John Hilton, David Wardle, Obed Mlambo, and Jumari Klassen are among some of the classicists that have ably looked at Rhodes from this perspective. However, here I will look at the art and architecture that surrounds Rhodes, or indeed the British of the Victorian era. Michael Lambert says about classics in South Africa. Classics is embedded in power relations which have and continue to exist between the different races which constitute South African society. Consequently, the history and indeed historiography of the classical tradition in this country should be rooted in the political, intellectual, and cultural milieus of the period of its reception and transmission. In the quote above, then, Lambert argues that classics was used to reinforce Afrikaner and British identities in South Africa. Obed Mlambo has also argued that the discipline of classics was used as, I quote, the handmaiden of colonialism, close quote. It is important, however, to have no illusions about the process of colonization, as this paper will illustrate. Ndlovu sums up the general tone of the times of Rhodes. I quote again, colonialism was a terrain of conquest, violence, dispossession, displacement, coercion, police rule, militarism, authoritarianism, anti-black racism. It was never a school of democracy and human rights. Radical difference was introduced by colonialism into Zimbabwe in particular and Africa in general. This violence, as I will argue, did not end with occupation, with colonial occupation. Rather, the state of Rhodesia and of Zimbabwe was built on violence, and this violence, I argue, continues to manifest to date, as can be seen also being perpetrated on monuments. Also, we see that some Rhodesian symbols like its flag, military fatigues, have been used as symbols of white supremacy in some parts of the world. A case in point is the shooting in 2015 of African-American church members by self-confessed white supremacist Dylan Storm Rhodes, who appeared in his website, The Last Rhodesian, wearing a Rhodesian flag as well as the flag of apartheid South Africa. The two flags have been viewed as symbols of white supremacy. However, it is wrong to treat these flags as symbols of racism because they have been used also as rallying points for people who were born in Rhodesia but have since left the country. I do not seriously think that all of them use the flag for reasons of hatred. John Hilton has also indicated that Rhodes was an average student of classics at Oriel. I mean, who wouldn't be an average student if you owned all the mines in Kimberley, you know? But he distinguished himself by wanting to live history rather than just to study it. The comparison between Caesar and Rhodes cannot be overemphasized. Rhodes owes his awareness of the dichotomy between civilization and barbarism, Greeks, Romans versus barbarians, English versus blacks, etc., to the classics. However, my colleague Budawashi Stofiri has argued that the men in the British South Africa in the British South Africa Company were driven by profit and cared little for the British Empire. Maybe we can move to the next slide. Okay, we can leave it there for now. But now to look at my approaches, the first approach that I want to employ is the approach of personality studies, where I ask what kind of persons were they, or what kind of person was Rhodes. But here I'm talking about Rhodes as well as his companions and people who related to him. This is similar, for instance, to Ndlovu book, called Mugabeism, in which the personality of Mugabe is put forward, such that then people can now start reasoning about other things around his personality. Recently, a book by Alexander Chula on Kamuzu Banda and the classics, which is called Goodbye, Dr. Banda, also shows the role of the classics in propping up Dr. Banda's charisma. Rhodes no doubt owed his classical education to the strong dichotomy. Sorry, I repeat. But moving on to the issue of personality studies in the Roman Empire. Speaking of Roman emperors and their depiction in Roman historical writing, David Porter says, given the extreme behavior exhibited by many of the holders of this office, it is little wonder that much of the political comment that has come down to us from the ancient Romans focuses on individual personalities. We all know about Nero and him piping while Rome burned, for example. That's the type of person that Nero would have been. Rhodes, on the other hand, is on record for saying a few statements. The first one being that the native is to be treated as a child and defined and denied the franchise. We must adopt a system of despotism, such as works in India, in our relations with barbarians of South Africa. That's the first statement that we said. And the second one is, it is humiliating to be utterly beaten by these niggers. He said this in respect of the defeat of the British by the Matabele army in the Wilson Patrol of 1893. And then the last quotation about Rhodes and me trying to build up a personality. Your instructions are, he told the major, to do the most harm you can to the natives around you. He ordered a police officer, kill all you can, even those in the valley who begged for mercy and threw down their arms. But of course, we know that Rhodes' attitude to Black people was always shifting, as can be seen in his will for the Rhodes scholarships, which does not specify race as a criteria for beneficiaries. On the other hand, looking at Rhodes' choice of readings, Rhodes had a vast library, which was collected at his express orders. As David Wardle notes, the library was carefully selected around areas that were of interest to him: Africa, exploration, and above all, classics. In May 1895, the country, that is Rhodesia, officially changed its name to Rhodesia, thus reflecting Rhodes' popularity amongst the settlers who had been using his name informally since 1891. The other names that had been proposed for the country were Zambezia as well as Chatterland, but of course the name Rhodesia went ahead. So the first approach there is personality studies. The second approach that I want to use is archival research. There are many archives on this study, for example, letters, diaries, and other documents from the native commission officers who were spread throughout the country. I still desire to read more of these. Most of these monuments were built long after Rhodes' death, and therefore there are records at the archives of who, when, why, how these monuments were built. The third approach that I want to adopt here is material studies approach, in which I look at the material remains of Rhodesian or Zimbabwean art and what came after it, including its modifications. Much of the classical character of Rhodes' memorials, especially those in South Africa, can be attributed to Herbert Barker, the architect, rather than to Rhodes himself. As mentioned before, most of these monuments dedicated to Rhodes were not done by himself, but rather posthumously, thanks to the Pioneer Fund as well as the Rhodesian Memorial Fund. In some cases, these monuments were erected based on eyewitness accounts of battles, places, dates, and so on. As such, my talk will be split into three parts. The first part will look at monuments that were erected for the dead, and then the second part looks at monuments that celebrate the victory, as well as the third part looking at post-colonial memorials, or what happened to the pre-colonial, the colonial memorials after independence. So, number one, memorials for the dead. I will start, of course, by defining what is an obelisk, which is standing in front of us in the chapter as well, in the title, as well as in our screens. An obelisk is a tapering stone pillar, typically having a square or rectangular cross-section, set up as a monument or landmark. The monument ends with a pyramid-like shape or pyramidion at the top. Originated with the Egyptians, even the Greeks, originated with the Egyptians, then the Greeks who called it obeliskos, then Latin, and ultimately English. In Egypt, obelisks were associated with the sun god. The obelisk can be viewed as a ray of the sun, But obviously, by the time the obelisks get to the Victorian age, they have lost this religious significance. The first memorials that I want to talk about for the dead, maybe we can move to the next slide, are the Shangani War memorials. Okay, so this slide belongs to the previous talk, but it's fine. It's an example of a local Rhodesian, Zimbabwean obelisk, maybe characterized by its simplicity, and also you can see it's in the bush next to a road with a fence, maybe to keep animals away so that they don't rub against it, and but people obviously can gain access as we will see as we move on. Next slide, please. So we will start with the Shangani War memorials. These memorials celebrate or commemorate the Matabele War. What we see on the left, the brownish object that looks like it looks like an obelisk, but it is not. It's a cane, C-A-I-R-N, cane. It's next to the Gweru Bulawayo highway. And this is where the king of the Ndebele, Lopengula, abandoned his capital, Bulawayo, rode northwest, where Major Alan Wilson would pursue him for the final showdown at the Battle of Pupu in Matabeleland North. The battlefield was designated as a national monument in 1937. A cane is a pile of stones that is used as a boundary marker, a memorial, or a burial site. Canes are usually conical in shape and were often erected on high ground. Burial canes date primarily from the Neolithic period and early Bronze Age. Let's move to the next slide. This one is the Shangani War Memorial in the Matobos next to Rhodes' grave, set up according to Rhodes' wishes, and it has a mural depicting some of the events of the last stand, which we will talk about shortly. This, I argue, can be compared to the Arapakis or even Trajan's column in terms of the murals depicting the events of the war. It has an inscription on the base which reads, "Erected to the enduring memory of Alan Wilson and his men who fell in the fight against Matabele on the Shangani River, December 4th, 1893. There were no survivors." The next slide, please. This is now the grave of Cecil John Rhodes, and in the background, that's the background, we see the memorial again in the Matopos. Rhodes had asked his people to erect this next to his grave. The next slide, please. The fight at the Shangani started on the Bulawayo-Gweru highway, and then when the king fled, he fled northwest along the banks of the Shangani River. So there was another engagement with the Wilson Patrol, in which it was on the 3rd December 1893, in which Major Alan Wilson and his troops were defeated by the Matabele army of King Lopengula. But this also marked the end of the Matabele kingdom because it was a Pyrrhic victory for the Matabele. I think thousands of the Matabele were massacred with the aid of the Maxim gun, while I think the Wilson Patrol comprised about 34 men, Interestingly, there was an event where the Zimbabwean government officials went to the Pupu Memorial, and the president himself, Mnangagwa, claimed that his grandfather had fought in the battle as well. So here we see politicians jostling for this space. And perhaps, as we will see, the obelisks must be modified. Perhaps we can move to next slide. This is what the Pupu Memorial looks like. The obelisk still stands, as you can see, and the murals are no longer made of bronze, but they've been painted. This is quite recent. I am not quite sure when this the wall and the paintings were done, but it's quite recent and it doesn't belong to the time when the obelisk was created. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Next slide. This is another view of the memorial with a list of the members of Wilson's patrol who died there. Next slide, please. This is the Philabusi Memorial. Philabusi is in Matabeleland South. As you can see, it was vandalized in 2016, perhaps for political reasons, when the government of, well, was Mugabe still alive? Yeah, Mugabe was still alive there, but yeah, people who sympathized with his views saw it fit to dismantle this memorial. But next slide, please. But this memorial has been restored and it is now stored at the Bulawayo Museum grounds with the help of the Zimbabwe Historical Society. I think it was restored in 2016. Next slide, please. This is the Pongo Memorial in the bushes, as you can see, but it's got names. Some of them have been chiseled out for various reasons. Sometimes someone would have been proclaimed dead when they were not dead, and they would come and chisel off their name, maybe in anger. Next slide, please. This is the Gweru Memorial, again, remembering the Matabele War of 1896. It is at the Zimbabwe Military Museum. Next slide, please. This is the Fort Rixon Memorial, unkempt, as you can see, but unmolested because of the local population's respect for the dead, according to the website. Usually, these memorials celebrate the deaths of people. In this case, 13 civilians died, 3 military men, and so on and so on. But yeah, this caption says that although the local people, well, on the website where I pulled it from, although the local people may not sympathize with the memorial, their respect for the dead has meant that it has remained in a good condition today as it was built. The next one, please. Next slide. Umlukulu Memorial. This is named after a nearby tree. I tried to squint my bespectacled eyes, and I thought the tree in the background is the one after which this memorial is named. But we can still see the obelisk standing tall there. And then the next slide, please. Inyati Memorial, serving the same purpose. It's standing in a cemetery, obviously, of the, well, shall we call them British dead or the Rhodesian dead? One of the two. You know, what's on the next slide now? Yes, this is a lovely monument. I thought depicting the cenotaph in Bulawayo. This is now the main post office in Bulawayo. And we can see an arcade in front with classical pillars, columns, as we can see them. But of interest is in this central arch, there is an obelisk, rough granite, you know, which still stands today, you know. But obviously this is, yeah, this was called the Matabeleland War Memorial. It's a cenotaph, which means it's an empty grave. It's just a memorial without any dead bodies inside. Next slide, please. And then now the second part of my talk looks at those memorials or monuments which celebrate victory. this is a wrong place to start because this is the Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town, but it helps to contextualize Rhodes and his view of the classics. And it's modeled on the Pergamon altar, which is on the right. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, what did Rhodes think of the English? He thought of the English as masters. He thought that the glory of Rome was gone and now was time for the British Empire. I contend that we are the first race in the world, he said, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Mlambo has also argued that when Cecil John Rhodes set out to colonize Africa, he was driven by classical motives. He further contends that Rhodes modeled himself around classical personalities like Caesar. Rhodes had a vision called the Pax Britannica, which was inspired by the Pax Romana. The British colonial masculinity, according to Mlambo, was inspired by Roman colonial masculinity. In this case, we see a connection between the Britannia and Roma, which has been extensively argued, with the colonial link being noted. There is a fair scattering, maybe next slide, please. There is a fair scattering of statues of Rhodes all the way from Cape Town through Kimberley, Pretoria, Johannesburg, Bulawayo, Harare, and even as far as Lusaka in Zambia. But what role did these statues play? Among other reasons, statues are planted for ideological purposes, as well as for reasons of exercising political control. There has been talk of biopower, a theoretical framework that looks at how the body is central in the process of human control. Foucault rightly argued that the body is not only a biological entity, but a site where power and knowledge are produced and enacted. I will here argue that statues in Rhodesia and Zimbabwe have been used to exercise this biopower. The placement of Rhodes' statue in Bulawayo's Main Street adjacent to the monumentalized Maxim gun, among other things, shows people who was in charge and how they had gotten that power. The retaliatory movements like Rhodes Must Fall were directed against this hegemony. So what we see here in the slide is a triumphal arch of Constantine in Rome and a rudimentary arch of Rhodes in Harare at the Harare Gardens. You will see that the arch of Rhodes is quite rudimentary. It's made of granite blocks. And when I took this picture, I think this is about a year back, it was overgrown. And right at the top, it's written in memory of Cecil John Rhodes. But what you see, the little bushes on my left side, on the left side of the arch, are bougainvillea flowers. It's overgrown, and yeah, no one really cares about it. Now, maybe next slide, please. Speaking of biopower, Denford Chifongose has pointed out that subsequently they are said that these boundaries work to control and separate people from certain places based on their human characteristics such as culture and identity. In many ways, the production of identities in relation to spatiality has closely been linked to the exclusion and othering of certain groups in cities. As such, the removal, defacing, and even replacement of these monuments is a barometer of measuring the political climate of the times. What we see, my slides, what we see in front of us now is on the left, a statue of Cecil John Rhodes, and on the right, a statue of Joshua Nkomo in the same place, perhaps standing on a similar pedestal, but we see the replacement of one by the other, and I think this is testament of this appropriation of biopower. Let's see what's in the next slide now. Okay, I'm sorry for the poor picture quality, but this was called the Pioneer Monument in Bulawayo, and this shows the Maxim gun on top. Again, it shows who is in power and how they got it. Thank you. Maybe let's go back one slide. Now, the installation of the Joshua Nkomo bronze statue is also nuanced. I believe that, sorry, the statue was constructed by the North Korean Mansudai Corporation, which was responsible for the creation of the sculpture at the Heroes Acre in Harare. My view of the statue, echoed elsewhere in public media, is that the statue stands as a reminder to the Ndebele population of the Kukuraondi massacres, in which the genocidal troops were trained by the North Korean instructors. In my view, this is an extension of this biopower by the Hararian-based government to the people of Matabeleland, just about the same thing: who holds power and what they are prepared to do to consolidate this power. A ZANU-PF official is on record for saying that the statue will be erected anyway, because ZANU-PF did not want to be seen to lose to the people of Matabeleland. So the background here is that there was an uproar about the statue of Joshua Nkomo, with some people saying it doesn't look like him, and some people saying that we can't have a North Korean architect after what happened in the 1980s, maybe with the complicity of North Korea government, but let's skip the next slide and go to the next. Okay, so this is now another obelisk, maybe the tallest in Zimbabwe, a World War II memorial, which was defaced around the year 2000, maybe by war veterans or maybe by ZANU-PF sympathizers. But if you look just above the plinth or the base, there is a circle which had some information, perhaps a picture, which was removed. And then on the base, there was a message which just says it commemorates the people who fought for the British empire in the Second World War, and so on and so on. But let's see what's in the next slide. So now this takes us to the third part of my presentation, which is monuments in Zimbabwe, or the post-colonial monuments. This is the Heroes Acre Theatre in Harare. There are many to be seen in the capital city, Harare, as well as in Bulawayo. The National Heroes Acre, that's from slides 25 to 28, is an open theatre built after independence in the 1980s. The theatre is carved against the slopes of a hill, pretty much like ancient Greek theatres, and is used for burials of officials of official so-called national heroes. The shrine is rich with friezes of the liberation struggle under the guidance of Robert Mugabe, who's got the largest head in the frieze. Maybe next picture, please. Not quite this one. Next one again. This is the frieze that I'm talking about. It's made of bronze, also made by the North Korean Mansudai Corporation. So we see the head of Mugabe at the topmost of the frieze. There he is, biggest picture with liberation fighters celebrating at independence. But yeah, in the previous picture, now, this is also a cenotaph, that is an empty grave, which is called the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. But the real heroes, like the ones who found their bodies in the Heroes Acre, are buried next to this, as we will see. So maybe next slide and next again. Thank you. Built in 1981 going forward, National Heroes Acre is a burial ground for national monument in Harare, measuring around 23 hectares. The site is situated on a ridge, and its purpose was to commemorate patriotic front guerrillas killed during the Rhodesian Bush War and contemporary Zimbabweans whose dedication and commitment to their country justify their interment at the shrine. Indeed, most of the recipients of the hero status are known to be ZANU-PF sympathizers. The monument itself is modeled after two AK-47 rifles lying back to back, with the graves resembling the magazines. The monument is an early example of the work of the North Korean Mansudai overseas projects, and it closely mirrors the design of the Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery in Taesong-guyok, just outside Pyongyang, North Korea. It is important to note that some of the art at Heroes Acre is classically inspired. Equally interesting is the fact that Mugabe is not buried there, thanks to the wishes of his family, or maybe even his wishes himself. Let's go to the next slide. This is a statue of Mbuya Nehanda, as it stands in Harare. Mbuya Nehanda was hanged allegedly for leading the Mashona rebellion in 1898. Mbuya means grandmother, aunt, and yeah, she perhaps has been viewed as a lamb of sacrifice, but she's supposed to have led, from a religious perspective, these uprisings against the colonial movements. The statue in Harare is draped in a heavy garment, a replica of the clothing that we see on the right. After her execution, British forces took her head and those of other rebels as war trophies. During the unveiling ceremony of the statue on Africa Day, President Mnangagwa vowed to continue to push for the return of the skull. However, the British authorities deny the presence of this particular skull. They invited Zimbabwe to come and prove and check which skull it is, but this effort was scuttled by COVID in 2020. Next slide, please. Yeah, Mbuya has been so unlucky because her face has been also appropriated in the never-ending issues of Zimbabwean banknotes. And here we see her face, if that's indeed what she looked like, next to the cenotaph, the tomb of the unknown soldier there. And then next slide. Well, I just put this one to be funny, but let's move to the next one again. Okay, so that's Uncle Bob, Robert Mugabe, with the statue that was presented to him. And perhaps a good place to perorate and come to the end of this talk. Although not directly classically inspired, we can safely conclude that most of Rhodes' classical art, is inspired by the classics. I mean, it's a bit difficult to say that a statue of Rhodes in Bulawayo is classical, except maybe if you look at the material like the bronze, But there are many nuances in classical Roman sculpture than that cannot be applied to Rhodes. But the images of the body of Rhodes are a show of biopower. Talking about the obelisks and statues, we realize that they have been a fertile battleground for politicians, showing the fates of classical media of art going through various phases of replacement, sometimes with a huge ironic twist. Indeed, it is ironic that the same government that frowned on the classics has demonstrated an affinity for the classics, at least on the face of it, when we see theaters being built and murals and stuff like that. This has been illustrated by the presence of classical motifs, for example, at the Heroes' Acre Shrine, and also the preservation of the obelisks, as has been demonstrated. Lastly, it is not true that Zimbabwean society eschews or is against classical art, as has been seen in these restorations of some vandalized monuments like the Filabosi monument. Perhaps the people are just indifferent to it, but to say they hate it, maybe not. And yeah, to end this talk, I would like to apologize to anyone who may have been hurt by any of my generalizations. Thank you very much. I will rest my case now.